Hi, welcome to clip 4. Quite a few clips this week. So we saw in the previous clip some kind of rudimentary elements or a rudimentary account of some elements of Marxist thinking and particularly focusing on this materialistic basis of his understanding of human social organization and phenomena based on the idea of labor as the main kind of avatar of human beings' constitutive embedment and interaction with the world around them as a historical process. So what I want to do in this clip is just acquaint you a little bit with the ways in which these ideas have been picked up in anthropology, which is really in some ways the most important part of this lecture for you to know about. And the place to start is to really see the ways in which Marx himself was interested in anthropology in the 19th century. So his argument about the historical progression, as we saw his historical materialist account of the progression of human history through this tension between means and modes of production, and technological changes and societal changes, is developed in dialogue with anthropological literature, the evolutionist literature at the time, and the interest in the origins of human institutions. He was just as much interested in origins as the evolutionists were, although, as I said, he put quite a different spin on that story by turning it into a historical story rather than a natural historical story on the Darwinian model. He showed particular interest in Lewis H. Morgan's monumental work, Ancient Society, which is one of the origin points of American anthropology. And he was particularly interested in the arguments that Morgan made at the time regarding the original matrilineal structure of what he would view as primitive, simple, pre-capitalist social organizations. And this was taken up by Friedrich Engels in his characterization of primitive communism in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, a text that has been much debated in anthropology ever since. The idea that resources were originally in this progressivist, not evolutionary, but historically, nevertheless, progressivist image of human history. Women were in charge of resources in the original position, and that this was the basis for primitive communism. And it's through the emergence of patriarchy and the kind of move that men make on women to take control of the resources that unequal distributions of resources and of power begin, and the story of human exploitation begins with patriarchy. That's an argument that's been much debated and of course much taken up also in feminist debates, but it's a Marxist argument that is founded on anthropological research, so it's interesting. It's also interesting to note that in the Soviet Union, Marxist historical materialism becomes the basis of the development of the discipline of ethnography, which has a very interesting trajectory in the kind of communist or socialist, state socialist world. And Marx really provides the framework for that form of anthropology as it was conducted in the Soviet Union. I have interacted a lot with that tradition of anthropological thinking in my own work in Cuba, because Cuba, being part of the Soviet bloc for much of its history, was profoundly influenced by these ideas as well. Cuban Academy, Cuban anthropology based on the kind of Soviet model of ethnography. In the kind of Western liberal democratic kind of countries in which the anthropology that you are all being trained in kind of emerged, you know, as I mentioned in a previous clip, Britain, France and the United States are the kind of centers, not disconnected to colonial history, of course. In those parts of the world, Marxism really becomes most influential in the 1960s and the 1970s. And this is for both political and for intellectual reasons. Of course, the post-war period is the period of anti-colonial movements throughout the colonies of Britain, of France, and of other countries. Local political movements emerge, guerrilla warfare, freedom fighters across Africa, Asia, Latin America, other parts of the world are developing, very often partly inspired by Marxist thinking themselves. And of course, anthropologists working in those countries, in many cases, become aligned with these anti-colonial movements, kind of this relationship of anthropology at that time becoming a discipline of the left, not universally by any means, but left-wing political ideas gain great traction within anthropology as they gain traction within student campuses across Europe and the United States. Think of the 1960s, 1968 in Paris and London at the LSE, kind of faint version of the Parisian May. And that kind of student activism is one in which anthropology students and staff also get involved. And Marxism really becomes a big thing in that period, right? At the same time, there's a kind of growing skepticism about what I called in an earlier clip the homeostatic tendencies of British social anthropology. And this emphasis, this Durkheimian emphasis on order and social reproduction, this static kind of holistic approach of representing social groups as somehow existing beyond history. This famous book by Eric Wolf, a great American Marxist anthropologist, called The People Without History. And an increasing interest in social change, social conflict, economic and political dynamics that shape social and cultural life, being in a state of flux, tension, conflict, opposition, and so on. I mentioned in an earlier lecture, as part of the critique of the society-based models of British social anthropology and structural functionalism, the Manchester School and their emphasis on dynamism and social change. And this, of course, comes from the fact that partly that Max Gluckman and people around him, Victor Turner, Bruce Kapferer, a whole bunch of people working at that time in Manchester were strongly influenced by Marx, and some of them were members of the Communist Party. So it's interesting to see how these political forces inform theoretical debate within anthropology. Okay, so that's a little bit about the historical development of Marxism within anthropology, just to kind of really give you some examples of the ways in which anthropologists have been Marxists. And I've singled out 3 ways to be a Marxist anthropologist, and really all 3 of them address a fundamental problem that anthropologists who were inspired by Marx had to deal with, which is, of course, that Marx's own writings are primarily focused, not exclusively as we saw, but primarily focused in an understanding and indeed a desire to overthrow capitalism. So his big magnum opus, Das Kapital, in 2 volumes. Is it 2? I can't remember now because I haven't read them. Is a study of the emergence of capital, right? And capitalism as the kind of most pressing and advanced form of human exploitation, as Marx would see it, right? But anthropologists at that time, we're talking about anthropology in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Britain, France, America, and so on, were still overwhelmingly working in societies that Marxists would deem to be pre-capitalist. Traditional, pre-capitalist, pre-modern, pre-literate sometimes, right? All of this the language of pre has a kind of implicit developmentalist, progressivist image of history, right? The idea that you come before something, as if that something is the definitive point with which you need to define yourself as being before. Really kind of critical, fundamental assumptions here about human progress make it into our language, right, and influence us in this Durkheimian social fact kind of way. Anyway, that was a bracket. So anthropologists saw themselves as operating in societies which were pre-capitalist. So how do we use Marx, who really is that he's most sophisticated in accounting for industrial capitalist societies in contexts which are not industrialized or capitalist, right? And there's three reactions to that. That's my way of kind of organizing it. The first is to actually recognize that so-called pre-capitalist societies, certainly the societies in which anthropologists were doing themselves field work, right? So this weird temporal thing, I mean, this is in the world that has high capitalism in it, people calling societies, because they are peripheral seemingly to that process, calling them pre-capitalist. So societies that exist at the same time are being ordered with respect to each other according to a temporal axis, really paradoxical. So anthropologists point out this paradox and say, this is absolute fantasy. Of course these societies are part and parcel of global capitalism, even if they may seem remote, even if you may be sitting in a mountaintop in a part of the world which hasn't got any major industrialized development, right? You are absolutely imminently influenced by the global system of capitalism. So a great example of this kind of approach is Sidney Mintz's Power of Sweetness book, which is an account of Caribbean ethnography, which basically sees the Caribbean as absolutely central to the development of world capitalism, connect this world systemic approach to doing anthropology by connecting what goes on in the Caribbean with, and particularly the production of sugar through the deployment of slaves imported from West and Central Africa to the Caribbean to basically provide the labor power to create this product of sugar, which is in high demand in Europe at the time of industrialization for particular reasons. So basically connecting the political economy of colonialism, of the slave trade, and of these exploitative relations of labor to the ethnographic particularities of society in the Caribbean at the time. So this is a kind of historic. Remember I told you how much Marxist approaches emphasize history. This is a political, economic, historically based argument about the anthropology of the Caribbean that Sidney Mintz is advancing. So that's one way, is basically to say that a part of the world that you may be tempted to study in terms of local kinship and ritual and cosmology and so on, actually is fundamentally informed and actually is absolutely central to the global political economy of capitalism. And you cannot understand it if you don't take that into account. That's the kind of approach that Sidney Mintz is a good example of. Another way of being a Marxist anthropologist is to use anthropology to actually speak back to Marxism and, in agreement with the fundamental premises of a Marxist approach, fill in and revise Marxist accounts of non-capitalist societies, right? So, for example, the work of Claude Meillassoux, which is on your reading list, a French Marxist anthropologist working in the 70s and 80s. His son, Quentin Meillassoux, is a very famous philosopher now in France. So Claude Meillassoux makes this very kind of detailed, ethnographically based, as well as historically based argument that shows that actually forms of exploitation that a Marxist account would associate with industrialized societies are actually present in these supposedly pre-capitalist societies, inasmuch as these are characterized by a mode of production, note the Marxist terminology, that is based around the domestic unit. He's talking particularly of kind of sub-Saharan African ethnography, where exploitation takes place, but is not this is not exploitation of one class by another, as it is in industrial societies, but rather of one age group by another and of one gender group by another. So he looks at how youth and women are effectively analogous in these societies, in these modes of social and economic organization based around the domestic unit, are analogous to the workers, the working class in a capitalist society. So women and young people are exploited by this male-based gerontocracy is societies in which the elders hold power. Forms of social and economic organization that that Claude Meillassoux found in sub-Saharan Africa in his analysis, right? So this is a kind of Marxist account of pre-capitalism that expands the vocabulary and the analytical framework of Marxism to include pre-capitalist societies in a way that Marx himself didn't do enough of, right? So it's a kind of anthropologically boosted form of Marxism that sheds light on anthropological material by using Marxist frameworks, but in doing so also enriches those Marxist frameworks. Finally, a third way of being a Marxist anthropologist is really to adapt some of the central ideas and concerns of Marxism to anthropological analysis, right? And of course, Claude Meillassoux is doing some of that, but I want to use a different example, the example of Maurice Bloch and his analysis of ritual. So the reason why I find Maurice Bloch a good example of this approach is that here we've got a classic anthropological question, the question of ritual, that Maurice Bloch seeks to address. Why do people conduct ritual? Is a question that anthropologists have been asking since the 19th century. And Maurice Bloch, influenced by Marxist ideas, is advancing an argument to answer this anthropological question that is deeply informed by his adaptation of the Marxist idea of ideology. And if you remember from the previous clip, Marx made the point that religion and religious forms are basically ideological constructs that are there to legitimate the forms of exploitation and inequality that exist in any given society. And really, Maurice Bloch takes that kind of approach to his examination of circumcision rituals among the Merina people of Madagascar, with whom Maurice Bloch has conducted fieldwork for many, many decades, and has written both historically and ethnographically for a very long time. And this article that I think I put on the reading list from 1973, which is later elaborated in a book that came out in 1992, basically looks at these circumcision rituals as forms of action through which in unequal relationships of power and control of resources are being legitimated. So ritual for Maurice Bloch in this Merina Madagascan context plays the role not just through meaning, as it would for Marx through the ideological kind of level of legitimation that he was examining, this idea of false consciousness that we saw in a previous clip, but actually through the action of the ritual itself serves to legitimate the unequal distribution, again, between the youths that are at the receiving end of this circumcision, being initiated and turning from boys into men through being circumcised. The power of the elders over these youths is affirmed through the ritual of circumcision. So this ritual is a boost and a legitimation of the unequal distribution of power between elders and youth in the Madagascan context for Maurice Bloch. The argument that he makes to establish this is really, really interesting. Going into the ways in which language is used during spirit possession in particular, as well as the use of alcohol and dancing and music, all of these being forms through which the ritual is able to act as this legitimating device for bolstering the traditional authority of the elders. So I encourage you to read that article to really go into the detail of how that works. Now, before finishing this clip, I really wanted to just mention, I'm not going to go into the details at all, a whole current of theoretical approaches within anthropology that has come to be branded as cultural ecology. And some of this rather overlaps with kind of arguments that you might have come across in biological anthropology classes that you take. Marvin Harris Roy Rappaport. These are key figures in American anthropology who have sought to develop materialist approaches to human culture by partly being inspired by Marxist approaches, but just as much inspired by environmental materialist approaches and ecological approaches, really trying to correlate and ultimately explain cultural and social phenomena in relation to underlying ecological forms of adaptation of human beings in particular environmental conditions, right? So the basis of culture being human beings' attempts to nourish themselves through their interaction with their environment in a kind of ecological context. And you can see the immediate kind of Marxist parallels of this kind of way of thinking. But what is interesting here is that this kind of way of being a materialist anthropologist is really driven by questions of nutrition and ecological adaptation rather than being driven by historical questions of conflict and historical technical transformation, unequal distribution of power, resources, and class conflict, as we saw with Marx, right? So it's competition for resources and nutrition that they have in common, but one lays the emphasis on history, the other one lays the emphasis on ecology, if you like, right? Hence the name cultural ecology. Just to give you a very, very, very crude example, extremely crude, Marvin Harris is more sophisticated than this, but I just want to give you a sense of the kind of idea that we're talking about here. In his examination of humans' very interesting relationship with pigs, and that's why I put that little pig on the corner of this slide, Marvin Harris reviews ethnological but also kind of ecological studies of humans' existence in parts of the world referred to as the Middle East, and basically, you know, the classical taboos that are placed in in Judaism and also in Islam around the eating of pork. And he connects, since these religions emerge in that part of the world, he connects these taboos, these eating restrictions around the consumption of pork with underlying human conditions ecological conditions that relate to human nutrition, and particularly the climate in that part of the world and the difficulty of rearing pigs and the health risks associated with rearing pigs in kind of these kinds of warm climatic conditions, and basically connect the prohibitions on pork eating in Judaism and in Islam with the scarcity of pork under these environmental conditions. Now, you know, as I say, this is a very crude rendition of Marvin Harris's argument, but I just want to give you a sense of what a kind of cultural ecological approach looks like. It's fundamentally materialist, just like Marxism is, but the focus is on ecology rather than history. Okay, I'll leave it there and I'll see you in the next clip.